Jim O'Neill, the Goldman Sachs economist who coined the phrase BRICS, says South Africa doesn't belong. What's your view? Does South Africa belong in a grouping like BRICS?
It depends on what you expect from the grouping. If it's an investment banker analyzing the emerging markets, it's probably other emerging markets in Africa that would qualify as well. But if you want a voice from Africa with a functioning economy, with good framework conditions, with a capability of picking up agendas, I think South Africa is a good representative there, and therefore makes sense. But it has shifted from an analytical tool more to the BRICS Summit is more of a symbol for multipolar world order, I think, and Africa needs a voice in that.
Well, if our place in BRICS is justified by our positioning in Africa, does that mean we have to place Africa's interests ahead of our own interests as a member of BRICS?
That's a tricky question that you're asking, and I think it's a difficult situation for South Africa. How much can one country speak for others, and how much can it speak for 53 others? South Africa will be there as a representative of itself, but it will also voice an African agenda, as that is part of South African foreign policy and its South African foreign policy priorities.
Well, one of the main aims of BRICS is to forge a common emerging market negotiating stance on issues from climate change to world trade, really to act as a counterweight to the West in forums like the G20. Do you think, as a grouping, we're going to carry clout in meetings like that?
If you see it as a counterweight, that's a bit more problematic, I think. It shouldn't be seen as antagonistic. As a preparatory round, that's very nice. It's very useful, and I think at the moment the key success of the BRICS is that it's happening. It does make for positive news, and it's a club that everybody wants to belong to. It's a group of countries that you want to be seen with in the first place. It's emerging and powerful countries. And that very much is the purpose of the BRICS at the moment. It's part of soft power for China, for Brazil, for South Africa as well.
It's also quite an eclectic mix of countries with very little in common apart from their emerging market status and also the size of the other four members apart from South Africa. Does South Africa's presence just make it more complicated?
I don't think so, because the four members already were quite diverse, so that you can't make it much more complicated, to be a bit ironic on that. Generally, I think you can agree on a couple of things as emerging economies. For instance, call for reforms in the international financial organizations, international financial governance structure. When it comes to details, it's getting more tricky, but you can put your weight into the scale. It's a bit like the G8, the Club of Industrialized Countries, which is also a club, and how much can they agree on a common agenda. However, they can agree on certain fundamentals that they can put to the table. And you're hitting the news with that, and you're setting an agenda by hitting the news with it.
How about the dynamics between member countries of BRICS? Brazil, Russia, South Africa, very rich in resources, competing for that Chinese market. Do you see this becoming a complicated relationship as we compete to get our resources into China?
It's in details, it might be complicated at times, but I would say, to put it into perspective, if you look at the G8 and where the economic weights are, the US is pretty much dominating the G8 as well, or it used to be dominating, it's getting less so. So that's similar, but it's not so much about rivalry. The countries come to the table to agree on a certain stance, to push their own weight and their individual weight. And of course there are difficulties in certain instances, but I think that's relatively similar to the G8 already.
Well, Sven, how about the opportunities then as you see them for South Africa being a member of this grouping?
It does provide, as I said, first of all, for a nice family picture, and I don't mean that to belittle the summit as such. It does provide opportunities for business to get together and to sign some deals, and I'm sure we will see some of those. And it does mean generally positive news for the countries. It does mean that an odd investor in the world might look twice at one or the other because they are growth markets. And for South Africa, it is joining that image, that club, that might mean that investors look twice and come to South Africa.
Any concern?
It will have to deliver. Sorry, it will have to deliver once the investor does come, however. I mean, that's the challenge then. It's the first step that you have, and it's the image that you can create now.
Any concern at all that South Africa could be dominated by those larger members in the grouping?
Not so much because it's a club. It's not an international organization where you would have votings or where you can be outvoted. It's bringing your voice to the table, it's bringing your agenda to the table, and then have a discussion. And it's a rather informal discussion. If you look at communiques of the previous summits, they are in relatively general terms.